welcome to the Swindon Spring Festival, or rather the virtual Swindon Spring Festival of May 2020. Thanks very much for joining us online. We do hope that all is well where you are. Now, COVID-19 restrictions have prevented us from putting on a live festival, but we're pleased that at least online, in a virtual way, the show goes on. And in this particular session, we're very pleased to welcome the author of Gilgamesh, The Life of a Poem. In a moment, our guest author will answer an introductory question or two, and then he will talk about his book for a while. And we'll close the session with me having a chat with him and asking a few more questions, those that festival followers have asked me to ask. So now please join me in giving a virtual, but nevertheless really meant Swindon Spring Festival welcome to literary historian, poet, novelist, translator, anthologist, editor, and publisher, Michael Schmidt.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's a pleasure. It would be a pleasure to be there, and it's a very great pleasure to talk to you on this occasion. Swindon. Yes, it's a place I was looking forward to visiting, to actually stopping in.
Well, we really are sorry that you can't be here live, but we hope to welcome you one day. Well, in fact, have you ever been here before? Do you know what goes on in Swindon?
I have been through Swindon quite often, obviously. I think most people have. And when I think of Swindon, I think of Richard Jefferies, about whom I've written. And I also think of Edward Thomas, who I believe spent some time in Swindon. I have no clear image in my mind of the city, except of one really ugly tall building. For some reason, that sticks in my mind. And it seemed quite a green city compared with central Manchester where I live. But it's been many, many years since I was there. And I can't remember why I was there. But yes, I have been there.
Yeah. Tremendous, Michael. It is a green city. It's learned a lot from development over the years. And that tower is known as the Brunel Tower in Swindon that you refer to. And W.H. Davies also stopped here once.
We published W.H. Davies. We did. He's a rather remarkable person. Of course, he lost a leg under a train, so that's quite appropriate that he should have come to Swindon.
That's right. That's right. And he stood and he stared and took pleasure for a while. Michael, we now come to your book, Gilgamesh, The Life of a poem written by numerous scribes over hundreds of years, starting more than 4,000 years ago, and a book about which many scholars say great things, and you yourself have said, this is a book, or this is a poem, Gilgamesh, that prefigures almost every literary tone and trope and suggests all genres in the West. Well, that's some poem, Michael. Over to you.
Well, having said that it does all those things, it's not to say that it's a particularly accessible or wonderfully readable poem. Those of us who've been reared on ancient poetry like Homer and less ancient like Virgil find it a very odd sort of poem. And when I was asked to write this book, I returned to it because I'd read it at school, and I'd read it in an early translation, the Penguin translation by Sanders, and it was a translation which made it seem very familiar. It was a prose translation. Reading it again, I discovered there were, I don't obviously know Sanskrit, I certainly don't know the Assyrian languages that it's written in. And so I began to read the various translations, of which there are quite a few in print. There are probably 10 or 12 in print. And each translation delivered quite a different poem. It was very odd. The most sort of bizarre of all was, I suppose, the Stephen Mitchell translation, which is extremely inventive. And he, like me, does not have the original languages. And so he compared himself to a bat flying around and trying not to bump into things. It was a curious image of the translator as navigating through all this rather dangerous territory in an attempt not to hit things. And it's a very smooth translation and a very, as it were, smoothed out translation. The thing about the poem that's fascinating is that, as you say, it was composed. We don't know if it was written. It was certainly composed, possibly orally composed. We don't even know that, over a period of 1,300 years. It started off probably about 2000 BC, and the last bits that we've found that relate to the poem, I think, are from about 700 BC. So 1,300 years of composition. without a single poet. There's not one poet wrote it or invented it or sang it, or it's probably like the biblical books that we read. It's probably a kind of amalgam of lots and lots of different approaches to the same poem, the same narrative, set of narratives. And it's also written in lots of different languages. So you think that you're reading a single text, but when you read the scholarly editions, which are fabulous and fascinating, you discover that bits have been pulled from as far away as Turkey in different languages from the original Assyrian, and they have been, as it were, fit together. You see where there's a gap. Of course, they were all it was all written on tablets, clay tablets with a burin in cuneiform writing. These tablets, many of them perish, so a lot of them are missing half a tablet. So you have half the as it were poem, and another tablet breaks in another place. You have another half, or a quarter, or a wedge, and the other bits that are found in different places and all over the Middle East are then fitted in. And what's really weird about the discovery of the poem is the English brought tons and tons of tablets back to the British Museum, of course, but at the same time the Germans were exploring the area, and so too were the French. So everyone was sending back tons of remains of writing, as it were, and statuary from the great ruins of Nineveh and Babylon and so on. Then the Americans got in on it. They too began shipping stuff back. Philadelphia has a huge library of fragments. And the scholar's job is to actually familiarize him or herself with all these fragments, and like putting together a 1,000-piece puzzle of, of a Bruegel painting, is somehow fitting them together. And bits of them will have faded in one way and bits in another. So it's not only a matter of seeing where they fit, it's also a matter of seeing where they shade in, or whether they shade in. It's a fabulous work of scholarship to recreate it. The other thing that really struck me was that there was a man called John Smith, who was probably from Swindon. He probably wasn't from Swindon, but we might as well say he was. I can't remember where he was from. And he worked in the mint. He was an engraver of banknotes. And he was a working class chap, but he was fascinated by it, I think because of engraving, because of the burin, the cutting into the clay. He was really fascinated by the cuneiform tablets. And so he went to the British Museum in his lunch break every day. And gradually, somehow, and I still can't work out the active intelligence and imagination that led to this, he worked his way into the languages, and he actually began translating. These are languages which had been quite lost. He began translating the tablets, and as luck would have it, the first tablet he translated was the flood tablet, where a flood bursts upon mankind, and the gods have decided to destroy mankind for being noisy and selfish. And he translated this, and of course that got anyone who was interested in the Bible, which is everyone at the time, absolutely fascinated at this earlier biblical narrative, or this earlier version of Noah's Ark. So this was published. It became front page news in America, in Britain, across the empire, and across Europe. And then it meant that thousands and thousands of dollars, pounds, etc., were thrown at exploration to find the remaining bits, to find more fragments which might relate to the Bible. So it's a really quite an exciting scholarly, what would you call it, a great scholarly quest, which is of course still going on. We're still finding fragments. Every 2 or 3 years another chunk is found, translated, and somehow wedged in, fit into the work. The greatest of all the scholars is a man called Andrew George, and he did the great Oxford edition, and he's always adding to it, and he's retranslating. And for him, it's always a work in progress. Even his own translations are a work in progress. He's fascinating when he talks about it as a work in progress, which will probably never be completed. I thought I'd just read you a little portion of the book, a bit of the introduction, which contains the lines that you read as well. And just to show you, it is a poem which I would not, I think, have read again for pleasure. but it's a poem which is so suggestive that you read it really for what it does to your thinking about poetry, if you like. It's the one poem I know, apart from Homer, I suppose, and some of the biblical texts, which does not have an author. It's a poem which happens. It doesn't, you can't say this is what the author thought, this was his point or her point of view. Gilgamesh, the oldest long poem in the world, is a relatively new classic. Parts of it were rediscovered, inscribed on clay tablets in cuneiform writing in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq and environs, early in the 19th century. Since then, it has become a work in progress, a collaboration led by Assyriologists, their discipline born of the poem itself, joined by archaeologists, ruin raiders, jihadis, museum curators, philologists, scholars, and writers who feel entitled to the poem, even when they lack the linguistic means to look at it directly in the face. And I'm one of those writers, because I write about this as though I were a scholar, and yet I don't have the original language. Gilgamesh, is it the first road novel? Gregory Corso called Gilgamesh Proto-Jack Kerouac, and Enkidu Proto-Neil Cassidy. Is it the first trip to hell, the first deluge, the first heterosexual romance in poetry? Does the love that dare not speak its name very nearly speak its name here for the first time? The poet Rod Mengham reflects, I love the fact that the earliest literary text we have enshrines friendship as the bedrock of our negotiations with the world and time. Gilgamesh also gave the first account of the uneasy triumph of nurture over nature. And then I talk about its genesis and things I've already said to you. But I think as non-specialists, we find meaning as we read, or read in the poem. We help to produce it by acts of selection, emphasis, and omission. Given the unstable text, we're always on shaky ground. No other literary adventure demands quite so much risk and care, so great an investment from the reader as Gilgamesh does. Few poems provide such uncertain yet sometimes exhilarating rewards. Reading is a matter of tuning and retuning. Given the damaged state of the tablets and the ambiguities of the languages in which it survives, we can never tune into the poem precisely. They're static, and the volume refuses to be evenly controlled. There are no rests, only gaps, a series of narrative highlights, equally weighted, though the tempo and dynamics change from episode to episode. With the passage of poem time, because Gilgamesh traces a history, the action, which begins with the protagonist as an oversexed youth in Uruk and ends with him bereaved, exhausted, accepting his own mortality, and still king in the same city, slows in pace, and the sky goes dark as it proceeds. And that's sort of near the beginning of the book. Now I'm prepared now to answer questions.
Thank you very much. I was enjoying it. I was lost in it. And one of the things I was thinking, Michael, was that this question of translation, and you know, in the Spanish language, they say traductor, traidor.
Yes.
In Italian, they say something similar. And that we can never be sure quite what we're getting. And to add to that, for comment on, somebody you mentioned in your book, Irving Finkel,
yes,
has been to the festival, and he's the philologist at the British Museum, and he came to the festival a few years ago and asked the people, a big audience, and said to them, "Who do you think?" And he was showing cuneiform tablets, and he said, "Who do you think created, invented the first writing? Philosophers, businessmen, or poets?" And very few people said B, said
yes,
the second category.
Yeah.
And so my question to you is, there we have translations, there we have lots of different scribes, here we have scholars still working on it. What makes this poetry? We've called it a poem.
What? You're getting into a philosophical corner here, or philological corner as well, aren't you? They wouldn't have called it a poem. I don't know what it would have been called in its own time. It being a kind of poem, a kind of the earliest kind of an text. I resist in my book the notion of calling it an epic, because a lot of the translations call it Gilgamesh an epic. It's not really an epic. It's in a sense it's far too heroic, not heroic. It's far too comic booky in a sense, and it's in its movement, the scale of the protagonist as opposed to the worlds they move through and so on. It's the action isn't the conflictual action ends well. There is quite a lot of conflict, it has to be said, but there's not a kind of pitched battle at any stage between two opposing forces. Again, that's not entirely true either. But I don't like the idea of seeing it as an epic, because that somehow confines it to a later form. And even to call it a poem is probably to prescribe what we should expect from it. I think that it has in it all the elements that go into the making of poetry later on, but you might as well say it has all the elements that go into the making of scripture as well, and that go into the making of various kinds of narrative. So it could be the original sort of novel, it could be Proto-Joyce. But
it really could, and when I think you mentioned in there somewhere, even children read it.
yeah.
I did not read it as a child, even though I read Grimm's fairy tales and Max and Moritz and things like that. And now that I've read it, I was actually asked to read it at university many years ago, and I remember what they say about Ishtar and what Ishtar does, and how they kill Umbaba, and I think, I'm quite glad I didn't do that as a child.
As a child. Yeah.
But are you serious that children somewhere are put through this?
Well, it's not so much. I mean, I read it when I was in my early teens at school because it was part of a kind of religious course that we were doing, and we particularly focused in on the flood. But I think children read it in comic books. It has been taken over and made into mangas and comic books and so on. It's also it makes wonderful. I mean, I think so many of children's comics are so violent. It fits in perfectly with this. The battle with Humbaba, for example, and some of the drawings that go with the comic adaptations of it are really quite strong, and they probably make more sense and more coherent sense of it than the various translators do. But I think what's really odd about it, you had Irving Finkel to the festival, as you say, and Irving Finkel is a humorous man, and he's I think he's a wonderful scholar, because he's always wanting to get closer to the text by human means as well as by scholarship. And he rebuilt, didn't he? Or he built the Noah's Ark, if you like, the Noah's Ark. But when you read the text, there are certain things you would expect a boat to look like, and you therefore impose on the text as you read it this sense of the boat as having a front to back and a hull and all that. But when you read the poem, all through the poem, there's not that much description as such. And so it says circumference, which suggests something round, because it has the word circ in it, doesn't it? What shape was the boat? What actual shape was it? And Irving Finkel comes up with one kind of boat, but you can see it almost as a Rubik cube. It could have been a cubic boat, and it could have been entirely round. There's nothing that gives you the actual shape. The poem is very full of as it were, if you like, templates, but not that full of images. And I think this is what leaves so much freedom and space for the translator. And it's a freedom and space that they tend to take advantage of, and often in ways which I think are quite treacherous to the poem itself when you read the scholarly editions.
Right. And in fact, I think just on the point about Irving Finkel, I think he came out with a coracle shaped.
Yes.
In the end, not a yacht or a cutty sark, a coracle.
Right.
In this incredibly accessible book, and if anyone hasn't read Gilgamesh, go to this to help you get into it. One of the things you do, Michael, is to help you write about it as well, and somehow to help you find evidence for your claim that this is a story, this is a poem, this is an epic that has had a greater bearing on poetry and writing poetry in the West than maybe anything else, or second only to the Bible or Shakespeare. And you write to 50 acquaintances who I imagine are in the world of poetry.
Yes.
You ask them 5 questions. I was particularly struck by questions 3, which was, what's your initial impression of the poem? And question 5, is Gilgamesh an informative element in your critical and imaginative being? In other words, how does this fuel you? How does this fire you? What effect does it have on you? What sort of responses did you get?
I got a tremendous variety of responses. Some people absolutely hate the poem, and most of the people who disliked it were female, because the poem is very much a poem of male heroes. The female figures, apart from the goddesses, were very much on the side of women, and apart from the tavern keeper that he meets on his way to the end of the world. Most of the relationships are between male figures, well, especially between Enkidu and Gilgamesh. So women writers find the violence gratuitous, the murder of the forest creature Baba repellent, and but some of them don't. Some of them found it really quite compelling. But the responses are very, very different. I think it is now being taken more and more as an eco poem. You know, it's a poem about nurture and nature. But because there are so many different translations, it really depends on which translation the reader read as to what the impact on that reader was. So if you read it, for example, in the scholarly translations, the Andrew George translations, you get one very strong impression of it as a complex and difficult work. And if you read it in the N.K. Sandar's, Nancy Sandars's original version, you get the sense that it's very much a forerunner of as it were, epic and biblical narrative. So it depends on how, and I think that's one of the things the correspondents wrote back and said. A couple of the correspondents were major scholars like Dick Davis, who's a wonderful poet, but also a Persian scholar. And he said that even now he prefers the N.K. Sandar's version, because he read it when he was young. And it's a very shapely prose version, which in a curious way uses liturgical language, so that the poem is almost Christianized, if you like, and the end is quite solemnly sacramental. But he still likes that one best, even though it is so untrue to the original, because it's the one that moved into his imagination. I would have thought that her translation has had most impact on the bulk of readers. It's still in print, and it's still very accessible and very readable. It's a very lovely, beautiful piece of prose. But other people reading the Stephen Mitchell or reading Andrew George's, or there are also people like Lawrence Durrell did translations of it, you know, and there's some wonderful experimental translations by members of the Cambridge School of Poets. And so, again, it depends on how you come at it. But it also depends on how long you stay with it, I think, because some people read it and are dazzled by it. Like Rilke, the great German poet Rilke, read a new translation. He was quite astonished by it, and he wrote to people about how wonderful it was, but he never mentions it again. So he had the great experience of reading it, and then he, as it were, it passed through him, you know, like a train passing through Swindon. It didn't linger. He didn't linger there. Whereas others, of course, read it and reread it, and then come to be fascinated by the language, the fragmentariness of it, and so on. So it's, in a sense, it's a great modernist opportunity because it's all in broken pieces.
A translator and scholar and expert on this, who you quite admire, or you admire very much, Andrew George,
yes,
is that it has entered the consciousness of the West. I read somewhere, and it occurs to me that you know, the way there can be many of us who may not have read much Shakespeare, we use phrases from Shakespeare, partly because other people do, and we pick up on them. And it occurs to me that, and I'm wondering whether you got any of that in the replies to from your poets, that, for example, the notion that Enkidu is a kind of forerunner of ecologists and environmentalists and back to nature people, and that Gilgamesh, even though a mythological person, is somehow something to do with some dominant man, like the men were, like the men are in Thomas Hardy in The Mayor of Casterbridge or something. So, and are we just, is that just a figment of our imagination, or are there people walking the streets today almost using utterances from Gilgamesh and notions from it?
I think you couldn't use as it were the language of Gilgamesh, because there is no stable language of translation. I mean, with Shakespeare, obviously you have the words. With Homer, you might quote Pope, or you might quote some of the later translations. You know, we all know a little bit about Homer, but with Gilgamesh, I don't think there's any verbal residue in the common language. What has entered the common language is the figure of Enkidu, of Gilgamesh himself, as you say, as a kind of tyrannical prototype, who is to some extent civilized by Gilgamesh, by Enkidu. And you have Enkidu, who is this creature of nature. He's the kind of creature that should have stayed with nature, because he used to free the animals from the hunter's traps and destroy the hunter's traps, and he used to run with the animals and so on. But he doesn't stay with the animals. He joins the civilization, and he then goes off with civilization and kills this rather wonderful creature, this monster who occupies the forest, either a cedar forest or a pine forest, depending on which scholar you follow, which is either east or west of where they lived, but again, depending on which scholar you follow. They kill Humbaba, this great creature, and they kill his various auras as well, and they tear down the forest. So I don't think he's very much a great ecologist, because he's more or less like the president of Brazil at the moment, you know, bringing down all the forests of Brazil in the interests of economic prosperity. So I think it has entered our consciousness as two prototypes, but I don't think it hasn't made its way into our minds the way that Virgil or Homer or indeed Shakespeare have done.
Right. Thanks, Michael. I'm steering you towards the final question, and it's the sort of question I always feel sorry for people who've spent 32 years working on something, and they get 1 minute and 32 seconds on the Today program or something like that, and the presenter says, what is your work actually trying to say? If you could just sum it up. We have 10 seconds till the pips come. But seriously, if I said to you, you know, I invited Michael Schmidt to come to the festival with his book Gilgamesh, because I know it's planted something in me, and whenever I hear the word, I want to go back to something I remember from when I first read about it, and people know about it, and people. I've checked over the last few weeks. I've said the word to people, and they said, "Yes, that's now what is that? Gilgamesh? Yes, something. Is it Cedars of Lebanon? Is it something to do with that?" And so they have vague ideas. So I want to, when I next meet them, I want to have a kind of 1 minute, 12-second précis of what is Gilgamesh trying to say? What is the story? What is the epic? What is the poem? What is the message?
Yes, well, if we were on the Today program, you would be telling me you must answer very quickly because we're running out of time. Okay. What interests me about Gilgamesh isn't the story. I mean, the story is interesting enough. I think what really excites me about Gilgamesh is the nature of it as a poem, and I think that's what people who read my book, who are themselves writers or serious readers of poetry, would probably take away. If we read it as itself, peeling away all the kind of expectations we have of the poem, if we're peeling away all the back projections we have, calling it an epic, even calling it a poem, it is a piece of work which may have had oral origins. It may have been recited and then written down. may have been written originally. It may be the first poem that was actually written down as a poem, unlike Homer, who was recited. It throws in, it is a poem without an author. That I found really fascinating. There's no point at which you can say, this is the, with Virgil, you can always say Virgil is the author of the Aeneid. With Homer, there's no Homer, but we project something onto Homer that is the poet. But it's very hard to project a poet onto Gilgamesh because it's so various and diverse. The pieces of it fit together so awkwardly that you can't say this is the product of one imagination. Its fragmentary nature is exciting too, because it means that the reader is forced into a kind of involvement that I wish contemporary readers were more often forced into with contemporary writing, a kind of involvement where your imagination and your intelligence are challenged, and often your value system is challenged as well. Am I running out of time?
No, this is perfect. I'm just getting that feeling. What did Wordsworth say? Long we had not talked, ere we built up a pile of better thoughts. And I'm suddenly thinking, we're just getting going. I was meant to put you down, but I think you're so right that it fires something in the imagination. And what I found is, strangely, even though on the page it doesn't seem to have wisdoms, when you go away from it, it carries you carry some sort of wisdom with you from it, which mystifies me.
Yes, that is very true. I think it doesn't tell you what to think. And I think that's a really good way of putting it. You come away with a sense of wisdom. I think most authored poems have designs on the reader, obviously, or they have designs on the subject matter. So they want you to be affected in a certain way. With Gilgamesh, there is no design upon you, and I think the wisdom you get from it is probably an observation of how these characters who are so unlike Enkidu and Gilgamesh are brought into relationship, relate, love one another, do terrible damage in the world, and then one of them is left alone. This sort of sense of bereavement is there. There's the kind of total despair of Gilgamesh with his losses and so on. It's I think that's interesting. Yes, the poem doesn't impart wisdom directly. It imparts wisdom as an experience rather than as a statement.
And it certainly touches on timeless things about the human condition.
Yes.
Don't you think?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
It does. And it also, one wonderful thing about it is that the urban is there. This is something very strange for us because this is 2000 BC, or between 2000 and 700 BC, 2,300 to 4,000 years ago. And it's a poem that you have the countryside, of course, because Enkidu is shaped in the countryside and runs with the animals. But you go to the city, and the city is at the core of it. People go out from the city, they kill Humbaba, but they come back to the city with the spoils of the cedar or pine that they bring back. I think that makes it very contemporary in a funny sort of way, in a way that Homer isn't. I mean, there are cities, obviously, in Homer. There's Troy and so on, but what matters really is, and in the Odyssey, of course, it's travel. Odysseus doesn't really go to that many major urban conglomerations. It's very funny to have the oldest poem that we have in the canon, if you like, as also an urban poem. You'd expect it to be a kind of rural poem, wouldn't you? Anyway, yes, wisdom.
You're tempting me to start all over again because I did want to ask you about its urbanness, but we don't have time. Michael Schmidt, thanks very much for bringing, even in a virtual way, Gilgamesh to the Swindon Spring Festival.
Thank you, Matt.
I hope you'll stop in Swindon next time. We have a lovely Richard Jefferies Museum. We have wonderful poetry groups, and we have quite a reasonably good festival of literature. But thank you very much for joining us. And thanks everyone who's been listening. Until we all meet again, keep well. But most of all, a Swindon Spring Festival thank you to Michael Schmidt.
Thank you. Very good.
Thank you for watching this virtual session at the Swindon Spring Festival of Literature and the Arts 2020. We do hope you enjoyed it. And we also hope that you will join us for the rest of this virtual festival. Here for you are details of the author you have just watched, their book, and our online information. Thank you very much for joining us, and keep well till we meet again.